I said, well, mister, you mean to tell me that all you need to get this airline going is a counter? And he said, yep. I said, well, mister, you may very well be leaning on it. So I'm dialing the phone, and I look over at him, and I say, incidentally, what is your name, and what's the name of this new airline? And he said, my name is Kenny Friedkin, and the airline is Pacific Southwest Airlines.
1946. America was making up for lost time. After years of war abroad and rationing at home, everyone was ready to enjoy a bit of the good life. Hemlines were dropping. Suburbia was beginning to sprawl. There were new cars on the highways, and the boys were home from across the two oceans. In San Diego, California, a flight instructor named Kenny Friedkin began aviation courses, catering to the newly returned veterans who wanted to learn how to fly using the GI Bill. Friedkin bought out partner Joe Plosser's interest and called the enterprise the Friedkin School of Aeronautics. As income from students on the GI Bill began to wane, Friedkin began to charter passenger flights in 1948. May 6, 1949. Flying a leased DC-3 with 27 passengers aboard, Kenny Friedkin roared off into the wild blue and began a weekly service from San Diego to Oakland via Burbank. He christened the fledgling company Pacific Southwest Airlines. PSA was a hit with the Southland population, although the company did go through typical growing pains. A large percentage of the passengers were military personnel, and the running joke during those early years was that PSA stood for Poor Sailors Airline. PSA was strictly an intrastate carrier, and therefore was under the jurisdiction of the California Public Utilities Commission. Because PSA was unencumbered by the Civil Aeronautics Board's strict route and fare rules, its fares were much lower than the interstate competitors. By 1955, the DC-3s in PSA's fleet had been replaced by the larger DC-4s. 1957. PSA had grown from a small group of flight instructors to a company of 250 employees and 4 DC-4 aircraft. In 1959, PSA entered the jet age with the acquisition of 3 Electra-prop jets. 1 DC-6 rounded out the fleet. In 1962, PSA founder Kenny Friedkin died, and Vice President of Operations J. Floyd Andy Andrews became the president of the airline. Andrews had been trained as a pilot by Friedkin during the early years of World War II and had flown for the Royal Air Force. A flamboyant personality, Andrews pushed for rapid expansion. In February of 1963, PSA stock hit the market and went from $19 to $30 a share in less than 5 months. 1965. 5 Boeing 727-100s were added to PSA's lineup. The New York Stock Exchange listed PSA's stock for the first time, greatly adding to the company's prestige. By 1967, PSA was a San Diego institution. The city loved PSA, and PSA was one of the major employers in the city. PSA was becoming the go-go airline, a trendsetter in the aviation business. The fleet now consisted of 727s and DC-9s, a totally jet fleet, and long the largest intrastate carrier in the United States. An application to fly interstate was turned down by the CAB. During the late 60s and the early 70s, PSA became more than just an airline. Radio stations, hotels, a car rental agency, and jet leasing companies all became part of PSA. PSA, the party airline. Its stewardesses were known worldwide for their go-go boots and miniskirts. In 1973, Andy Andrews became PSA's chairman of the board, and another former pilot, William Shimp, became PSA's new president. It was also in 1972-73 that PSA Incorporated was formed. November 1973, over 1,300 PSA employees represented by the Teamsters struck in a wage dispute. Non-striking personnel were able to keep 60% of the planes flying during the 38-day strike. 1974 was the year of the wide bodies. PSA acquired 2 Lockheed L-1011s with the intention of using them in the heavily traveled LA-San Francisco corridor. But costs of fuel forced the big planes to be grounded. PSA's hotels and radio stations were put up for sale in 1975. The car rental agency had been sold earlier. In 1976, Andy Andrews left PSA and Bill Shimp took his place as Chief Executive Officer. 1977. Once again, PSA sought approval from the CAB to fly interstate. The request was for service to Las Vegas and Reno. And in 1978, after years of effort, PSA became an interstate carrier. Everyone at PSA remembers that September morning in 1978 when PSA Flight 182 went down. It was a loss that touched everyone. Those employees, friends, passengers, and loved ones are still thought of and missed. PSA's first year as an interstate carrier was outstanding. During 1979, the airline carried 8.6 million passengers to 15 cities, including Phoenix and Salt Lake. The Scripps Reservation Center went into operation during the year, and a new training building was begun as part of the same complex. In 1980, the airline took delivery of its first Super 80, a quiet, fuel-efficient, new-generation aircraft. The halt of operations was caused by a 51-day pilot strike during 1980, and pre-strike service levels weren't reached again until well into 1981. By 1982, PSA was flying 21 new Super 80s and 9 727s. The airline entered into an agreement with Braniff Airways to lease and purchase equipment and assets intending to form a new division of PSA based in Dallas. But by 1983, the deal was dropped. In 1984, Paul Barkley, president of PSA, became chief executive officer. William Shimp passed away in May of that year. 1984 saw the delivery of the first British Aerospace 146s and the 26th Super 80. 1985. Russell Ray became the president of PSA, and Paul Barkley became chairman of the board amidst an ever-increasingly competitive marketplace. December 1986.
U.S. Air will take over PSA. It was a packed house today, standing room only, as Kolodny met with PSA's employees for the first time.
We want you. We want you to be part of our group. We want to take the great airline that you've built over the years and merge ultimately the U.S. Air operation and have a very strong, good company.
I can't remember when PSA Airlines didn't exist. I was raised in San Diego, and every 15 minutes a jet would go over, and whenever I got to ride on a PSA airline, I always loved the stewardesses. They were so nice, they were so pretty, and I thought, one day when I grow up and my legs are as good as those, I'll wear a PSA uniform. I always wanted to be a stewardess, and that was really where it started. I never got to do it though, but I have done a lot of flying, and I really have to thank the smile on the faces of those stewardesses that got me thinking about it. So thank you, PSA.